June 22, 1941, the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union. It was the largest military operation in human history. It was, without question, Hitler's greatest gamble of the Second World War. For 24 hours, the National Socialist plan, the Nazi plan, worked to perfection, capturing over tens of thousands of Russian prisoners, inflicting terrific casualties on the Soviets, and the operation, this great three-pronged attack in the Soviet Union, was off to a tremendous start. In this, our 10th lecture of the series on the Second World War, we're going to examine the German campaign in the Soviet Union in the summer and fall of 1941 to try to determine whether or not the Nazis could have won in the Soviet Union in this initial phase of the campaign, whether their failure to take Moscow in this summer and fall campaign would prove to be fatal for the regime, whether it marks a terrific turning point in the war. Certainly, in those first days, the campaign went spectacularly for the Germans. Army Group North drove 155 miles through Lithuania and into Latvia in 5 days alone. Movement on a scale unprecedented in European history. By July 10th, German armor was within 80 miles of Leningrad in the north. Army Group Center carried out 2 gigantic encirclements of large Russian forces, one near Minsk, the second near Smolensk, 200 miles farther east in mid-July, capturing almost 500,000 Russian prisoners and inflicting horrendous casualties. On August 5th, the last resistance in the city of Smolensk came to an end. The Germans in Army Group Center had covered 440 miles in 23 days and were only 200 miles from Moscow. Army Group South found the going a bit slower, encountering fierce resistance in the Ukraine, but still German units were moving steadily forward. General Franz Halder, the Army Chief of Staff and the man most responsible for the planning of the campaign, wrote on his birthday, June 30th, quote, "The Russians lost this war in the first 8 days," close quote. And just a few days later, on July 3rd, he noted in his diary, and I quote again, "On the whole, one can say that the task of smashing the mass of the Russian army has been fulfilled. It is probably not too much to say when I assert that the campaign against Russia has been won within 2 weeks." But the Germans, despite their astonishing gains, were confronting some disquieting problems. The groups, army groups, particularly Army Group Center in North, had begun to outdistance their supplies and were encountering mechanical difficulties, especially the armored units. The roads and the terrain in the Soviet Union were not exactly what they had expected. Looking at the map, the Germans they'd done reconnaissance, they thought they understood what they were getting themselves into, but looking at the map of the Soviet Union, they had what seemed to be major roadways, modern roadways. Upon encountering them, they discovered in many cases were nothing more than sort of dirt tracks, sometimes gravel, hardly the superhighways, the autobahns that the Germans had been building in Germany since the early 30s. The terrain was much more difficult, the transportation more difficult, the roads far cruder than the Germans had anticipated. Nor was the Red Army behaving quite the way the Germans thought. The Russians had been roundly routed. The Blitzkrieg was working as if by textbook, and yet the Russians didn't seem to understand that they were defeated. They weren't playing, they hadn't read the text. One gets, on the one hand, this sense of tremendous euphoria. I mean, the Blitzkrieg, hundreds of miles, hundreds of thousands of prisoners, terrific casualties inflicted on the Red Army, and yet the Russians aren't behaving the way, for example, the French or the Belgians had before them, or the Poles. You can imagine the frustration back at Army headquarters, Hitler's headquarters, looking as one looks as the pins move in the map and the lines are drawn in the map. Each day, the Army groups move deeper and deeper into the Soviet Union. Each day, the after-action reports disclose hundreds of thousands of Russian prisoners of war, Russians surrendering in incredible numbers, terrific casualties, unbelievable casualties inflicted on the Soviets. And yet, the Russians fought tenaciously, even when there was little or no hope of prevailing. And they were inflicting terrific casualties on the Germans as well. One of the problems that the Germans encountered was the problem of their own making. We discussed in the last lecture these extraordinary orders directives given to the German troops entering the Soviet Union about this was a war without quarter, a fight to the finish. Don't expect humane treatment if you're captured. Therefore, don't necessarily take prisoners yourself. The German behavior in the Soviet Union was so brutal from the very outset that Russians, despite the fact that the Germans captured hundreds of thousands of them, the other Russians, if there was any option of fighting on, they did, even when there was very little chance of survival, in part because they didn't want to fall into German hands. Moving along, and this is not a topic for this lecture's discussion, but we will certainly come to it. Moving along almost with the troops in the Soviet Union were special SS commando units called Einsatzgruppen. These SS units were given, quote, special orders, special tasks. They were to move against the saboteurs, guerrillas, and Jews in the Soviet Union. And so all across the Eastern Front, along with the military operations, which are going swimmingly for the Germans, these Einsatzgruppen, these special SS commando units, were conducting a bloodbath all over the Soviet Union. Wherever the German troops moved, were killing, we estimate, no one knows for certain, but it is estimated these Einsatzgruppen would kill almost 1 million Soviets within the first few months of the war, mostly Jews. But it was a distinction that if you were on the receiving end of this, was not an easy one to make. The Germans were behaving in the Soviet Union like the barbarians they maintained that the Soviets were, and as a consequence, these Russian units, if there was any hope, falling into German hands was death, they assumed. And so they fought with incredible tenacity against the Germans. There was a second reason, too. Stalin, who, as the invasion had broken on his western frontier, had gone almost into seclusion for about 48 hours, afraid of assassination because he had ignored so much of the intelligence suggesting a German attack. Stalin rallied, and the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, and the political commissars in these army units were also instructed, given very clear instructions, if people break ranks and begin to run, to retreat, this is desertion, and these people are to be shot instantly. So if you're a soldier in the Red Army, you've got the Germans in front of you behaving in one barbarous fashion, you've got the NKVD behind you acting in another. There's a particularly chilling description of this. This comes a bit later on in this first attack into the Soviet Union, actually from the siege of Kiev, but I think is worth reading to get some sense of the position that these troops found themselves in. Talking about a Russian unit, as the Germans advanced in this Russian unit around Kiev, a German watching this wrote, Stalin presided over their death, for specially trained electricians had rigged up apparatuses and played recordings of his speeches to the defenders of key positions. This is around Kiev. During the fighting, the words of Stalin, magnified to gigantic proportions by the loudspeakers, rained down on the men kneeling in holes behind the tripods of their machine guns. Din in the ears of the soldiers lying amid the shrubs of the wounded writhing in agony upon the ground. The loudspeaker imbues that voice with a harsh, brutal, metallic quality. There is something diabolical and at the same time terribly naive about these soldiers who fight to the death, spurred on by Stalin's speech on the Soviet Constitution. By the slow, deliberate recital of the moral, social, political, and military precepts of the party, about these soldiers who never surrender, about these dead scattered all around me, about the final gestures, the stubborn, violent gestures of these men who died so terribly lonely a death on this battlefield amid the deafening roar of the cannon and the ceaseless braying of the loudspeaker. The Russians then would expect a very high price from the Germans as the Germans moved deeper and deeper into the Soviet Union. Even the lack of coordination confused and perplexed the Germans. Communications between Moscow and top military headquarters in the front had broken down as the Germans made these great advances into the Soviet Union. As a consequence, a great many military units cut off from the rear by this breakdown in communication, confronting the Germans, simply fought on in their own way, uncoordinated military activity along the front. And this confused the Germans. They couldn't figure out what was going on. Was there a plan to this? Why was this unit moving here or there? Was this part of an overall plan? It wasn't, but the Germans certainly did not know that. What one sees already at the end of the first month of the campaign, that is by the end of July, is that the panzer leaders in these three German army groups are still wildly enthusiastic about the campaign. This is going to them absolutely according to the book. Huge pincer movements, they break through these Russian lines, roar across this flat Soviet terrain, moving quickly, closing the pincer movement, closing the pincers on these Germans. So the panzer leaders remain tremendously optimistic, very keen on the operation. But the infantry units that were following them in, the motorized infantry, and then behind them, at what I often refer to as the bottom of the food chain, the infantrymen who are walking their way into this, who are having to, quote, clean up the final resistance. The infantry officers had begun to have a very different view of what the war in the East was all about. For the panzer leaders, it was movement, close the encirclement, move on for another one. For the infantry units, these were the people who were closing with and fighting with the Russians at close quarters, and this was a war that they hadn't anticipated. It's true that the Russians were being pushed back. They were surrendering. They were being killed, wounded in massive numbers, and yet, as one German wrote home, this is not like France. This is not, which was, he suggested, maneuvers with live ammunition. This was real combat, and of a sort that was unnerving. Especially as the Germans drove deeper into Russia, they left behind thousands of enemy troops, stragglers, partisans, who sniped at them, who made hit-and-run attacks on them, small units, platoons, companies of Red Army units that now became partisans, who simply lived off the land far behind German lines. When certainly the Germans didn't know where they would show up or how they would behave. One sees in the letters written home by German soldiers and also the entries into the German war diaries many instances where far, far, far behind what the Germans thought were the front lines, a company-sized Red Army unit would show up and launch an attack. This was something that made life behind the lines difficult for the Germans, and that the Soviets were fighting with everything they had available to them. They may not have had, the Germans had maintained, believed, German intelligence had led the high command to believe that Soviet military technology was crude. And in these early days, it certainly seemed that as if that were the case, the Russian Air Force and so on. But even the crudeness of the way with which the Russians fought proved to be unnerving to the ordinary soldier who found himself confronted with the Red Army and its remnants in the East. One instance of this, which I'd like to read you, an entry from one German who survived an attack far behind German lines on the main highway from Korostin to Kiev. The map depot of the 6th Army was just taking up a bivouac in a village far, as I said, behind German lines. We had no proper sentries, the man wrote. Just a few men strolling about with their rifles slung over their shoulders, as the whole of the 16th Motorized was meant to be between us and the Russians. There was quite a lot of fraternization with the villagers. I remember that some of them had never seen a lemon before. Then the inhabitants began to withdraw to their homes. We thought that seemed a little peculiar, and soon the village was completely empty of Russians. A short time afterward, there was the sound of horses and a dust cloud to the south. Some people said that it was a supply column from one of the Hungarian divisions. It was a Hungarian division fighting alongside the Germans in the invasion. Then they were upon us, like an American film of the Wild West. Sturdy little horses, riding at a gallop through our camp. Some of the Russians were using submachine guns. Others were swinging sabers. I saw 2 men killed by the sword less than 10 meters from me. Think of that, 80 years after the Austro-Prussian War. They had towed up a number of those heavy 2-wheeled machine guns. After a few minutes, whistles began to blow and the horsemen faded away. The machine gunners started blasting us at very close ranges with enfilade fire. Soon tents and lorries were ablaze, and through it all the screams of the wounded men caught in the flames. This kind of behind-the-lines attack was something that the Germans in their planning simply hadn't calculated. The French, the Belgians, the Dutch, all of the others that the combatants that the Germans had confronted, when the situation required it, simply surrendered. This was it. You made a logical choice, a rational calculation, and surrendered. One gets the sense with the Germans, even as things are going extremely well for them, there is this growing sense that what they've got, they have a tiger by the neck. They're winning, they've got it down, they're holding it, but they can't possibly relax even for a second. There's no way to relax, because if they do, then it will be upon them. In addition to the fact that the Russians seemed to be beaten but didn't know it, and that we're fighting against all odds, one begins to see in the Kriegstagebuch, the war diary of the High Command, some other disturbing revelations. A new weapon had appeared on the front. The Germans were convinced that they had the best tanks in the world. There had been some advances since the summer of 1940, and they were also convinced that although the Soviets apparently had more tanks than anybody else, that these were technologically crude, hardly a match for German technology. But the tank that they began to discover a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks into the campaign was the T-34 tank, which was certainly more than a match for anything the Germans could put in the field. In fact, it was the most technologically advanced tank of its time. This was very disturbing news to the German High Command. Franz Halder, who, as you'll recall, had been writing in his diary on his birthday and shortly thereafter that the Russians had lost the war within 8 days, then he revised it to say 2 weeks. Now there's this sort of sense of, well, now wait a minute, where did this come from? Why didn't intelligence tell us that this was out there? And it wasn't just a prototype. The French also had good tanks, they'd had good airplanes, but they hadn't developed them. They weren't there in numbers. The T-34 began showing up in surprising numbers already in the campaign in 1941, and this was a great concern. So the war was already a source of some frustration. On the whole, things were going better than they could have anticipated. Tremendous gains. And again, the perspective from back at headquarters, just looking at the map, and especially if one is from a German perspective where the distances are quite small, now to be thinking in 100-mile breakthroughs and so on, this was quite amazing. But these problems had also begun to surface. They were only problems, disquieting problems at this point. They would come to be major problems a bit later on. At the strategic level, then, as the Blitzkrieg continues to work and to work according to clockwork, at the strategic level, a debate erupts. And it erupts in mid-July, about a month into the campaign. Hitler proposed at this point diverting panzer groups from Army Group Center to Army Group North for a drive on Leningrad. Hitler had always favored a drive to the north, through the Baltics, with Leningrad as its main objective, and he revives this at this point. He also wanted to divert another armored group from Army Group, another armored division from Army Group Center, to take Guderian, Heinz Guderian's division, and send it to Army Group South, where another great encircling movement seemed to be possible. Halder, Guderian, the other German commanders, most of the other German commanders were quite unhappy with this. They wanted to they wanted to concentrate as much as possible their forces for a drive on Moscow. Moscow seemed to be there for the taking. Meanwhile, the panzers halted. The German advance into the Soviet Union halted as this debate was sorted out. Where were the Germans going to concentrate their forces? Not until August 20th were the panzer divisions finally diverted as Hitler desired, that is the weakening of Army Group Center, and the offensive began to move again. One of the questions that has certainly surfaced and continues to be debated is whether or not the Germans could have taken Moscow if they had concentrated their forces, if they hadn't wasted this time in late July, early August. This was good campaigning weather, perfect campaigning weather for them, but at this point, the operation didn't so much stall as simply stop while the Germans tried to decide exactly what their strategic position ought to be. One factor that has to be considered in making up one's mind about this has to do with logistics. The Germans were having all sorts of problems with supply. They had outrun their supplies. The road conditions that we've described were very bad. The train connections, the rail lines in the Soviet Union were difficult for them to use. The Russians continued to harass them. Partisans were blowing up the railroad tracks behind the lines and so on. So there were strains, very serious strains in supply for the Wehrmacht at this point. The other problem for the Germans, too, was that the Germans had stretched their own manpower to the absolute limit. The Germans were operating at this point really without reserves. They were at the end of their reserves. There hadn't been yet a total mobilization of Germany for the war, and they were largely at the end of their reserves. And there were some troubling indications that the Russians were beginning to move troops from elsewhere toward the west, that there were Russian reserves of manpower available that were being brought to bear on the situation. So one of the arguments that Hitler used was, if we make a spearhead directly for Moscow, we're likely to outrun our supplies, sure enough, and if these Russian reserves are in fact out there, what if they cut off this spearhead? We'd be opening our flanks. This would be disastrous. Better to move in the way we're doing in this broad front. Regardless of how one evaluates this, the very debate within the German high command is itself symptomatic of the Germans' biggest problems. What the debate revealed is that Operation Barbarossa had already failed in its original objective. The Germans, it had not destroyed the Red Army in Western Russia. The Germans had attempted too much. They couldn't proceed on all of the objectives at once, and they were still 200 miles from Moscow. Their anticipation that if they inflicted devastating enough casualties on the Russians that they would surrender or just completely break down had failed to materialize. And as a consequence, this very debate, do we concentrate on Moscow, do we move toward Leningrad, to Kiev, already reveals that this original objective, the stated mission of Barbarossa, had not been attained. In September, the offensive resumed. The city of Leningrad was put under siege. A cruel siege indeed, in that winter of 1941-1942. 200,000 inhabitants of Leningrad would die as a result of starvation, and malnutrition-related diseases would freeze to death in this city in the north. In the south, Kiev fell to a gigantic encirclement, and 600,000 more Russians would go into German captivity. And Kiev finally fell on September 26th. On September 30th, Army Group Center finally moved on Moscow. The drive, once again, textbook perfect. 600,000 more Russian prisoners of war. A general panic in Moscow broke out. Stalin ordered tank traps to be dug, trenches to be dug around the city. There were rumors abroad in Moscow that the government was abandoning the city and moving east. Panic began to break out among the civilian population. It looked as if at this point that indeed the unraveling of Soviet society, of the Soviet regime, which the Nazis had anticipated, was finally going to happen. One of the most extraordinary achievements of the entire Second World War, in fact, a miraculous achievement, also took place in this very same period. And that was the dismantling of Russian factories. About 1,500 Russian industrial facilities were dismantled bolt by bolt as the Germans bore down upon them, the Germans with complete air superiority, Attacking all across the range of the Western Soviet Union, the Russians dismantled 1,500 factories, put them on railroad cars, take them east, move over 1 million workers to the east, and began to build new industrial cities beyond the Urals and in Siberia, away from the Germans. It was an extraordinary achievement by any standard, an amazing achievement, something the Germans certainly hadn't anticipated. At the same time that the Russians are doing this, Adolf Hitler gives an order to put the German economy back on a peacetime footing. The war in the Soviet Union was over. It had been won. Hitler did not want to strain relations at home. He wanted to keep business as usual, not a full mobilization of Germany's economic resources. And so the German economy was to be put back on a peacetime footing. The offensive, which had been launched at the end of September, this final move toward Moscow, ran into trouble with weather. Not the snow that one usually thinks about with the Soviet Union, but rain. It fell steadily through much of October, and in many places the tanks and trucks, mired in the mud, could not move, and the offensive bogged down, in fact stopped, until November. When the frost finally came, when the weather began to get cold, then the Germans were able to move again and resume the offensive, the move toward Moscow, at the beginning of November. This final drive for Moscow began on November 15th, when the ground had finally frozen enough for the tanks to have the necessary foundation they needed. But German forces at this point were badly weakened by losses. Their supplies were inadequate. The tanks were having mechanical troubles, and the weather, which had been a problem from the beginning, not snow up until this point, but rain, now turned genuinely ugly. The first snow in October, a dusting, had been a mere preview. In late November, the temperature simply dropped like a stone. Temperatures by late November reached 10 below zero Fahrenheit. German troops had been issued no winter clothing, not even overcoats. They were operating in the Soviet Union in cotton uniforms and denim. The vehicles had either little or no antifreeze available. They were supposed to be already out of this theater by the time winter set in, and progress was agonizingly slow. The tanks had to have fires lit under them so the engines wouldn't freeze. If you opened a can of rations, if you didn't eat it immediately, it would freeze within 30 seconds at the end of November. The Russians, meanwhile, were not only preparing a defense of Moscow, but planning a major counteroffensive. Georgy Zhukov, who was placed in charge of the defense of Moscow, a general who had earned his stars out fighting the Japanese along the Manchurian frontier, something we'll talk about in a subsequent lecture, was put in charge of the defense of Moscow. He began moving reinforcements from the Far East, assured that the Japanese would not attack. These movements, the Germans had very little knowledge of. Troops from Siberia, from the Far East, began arriving east of Moscow, reinforcing the Red Army position. And then, on December 5th, 1941, Zhukov launched a massive counterattack north and south of Moscow, catching the Germans completely by surprise. It halted the German offensive. It not only halted it, it threatened to turn the German position into a complete rout, a catastrophe for the Germans. This counteroffensive would stall in January and February, and the Germans would resume their offensive operations in the spring of 1942. The war wasn't over. The Germans hadn't been defeated. It would be the Germans who would launch a new offensive in the spring of 1942, not the Russians. But there was no disguising the fact that the blitzkrieg phase of the war had come to an end. Germany was now in for precisely the long, protracted conflict that Hitler had hoped to avoid. He had not been able to either destroy the Red Army or seize Moscow, and now, having just ordered the economy to go back on a peacetime footing, he was now forced to make the reluctant admission that this was a war with no end in sight. Not only that, events all the way across the globe at Pearl Harbor 2 days later would transform what until this point had been a European war into a genuine global conflict. And 4 days after that, Adolf Hitler would declare war on the United States, so that a global conflict was now at last a reality. That's a story that we will take up down the road.